yeah, a news article they're probably only reading the abstract, by the way. So they're trying to summarize from the abstract. They're looking at
A summary of a
a
summary.
summary of a summary. Yeah, which now can actually cause misinterpretation.
Seekers of truth, advocates of facts, evidence, and data, and skeptics of exorbitance. It's time to prove it to me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prove It To Me podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law, and I can't wait to introduce you to our guest today and talk about research. But first, and I'm really, really sorry about this, I already lied to you. If you happen to listen to the trailer, I told you I would be bringing academics onto the podcast and I would have them tone it down so we wouldn't get to a point where no one could understand what we're talking about. I did a real shitty job of this right off the bat when we started this interview. So I'm going to preemptively correct my mistake. I'm giving you a glossary of terms here, which I'll include it in the episode notes, but I'm also going to walk you through these things right now. So buckle up. Here are some of the key words you'll hear during this podcast. So here's our glossary of terms. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a variable. A variable is an observable characteristic. So in research, a variable needs to be measured in some way. There are all sorts of different types of variables in research, but today we're focused on just two types of variables. The first is independent. The independent variable is the variable that changes. And in research, we try to measure whether changing the independent variable influences the dependent variable. For example, if we want to find out the relationship between watering an apple tree and the number of apples it produces, the amount of water is the independent variable and the number of apples produced is the dependent variable. Okay, stick with me. I've got a few of these things to get through here. Treatment. Treatment comes up. In simple terms, this is another way to refer to the independent variable and the changes made to the independent variable in the research. So, in that same example I just gave you, the treatment is changing the amount of water given to the apple tree. Okay, we're also going to talk about correlation and causation. So, correlation, this is a measurement of the relationship between two variables. And in research, it's actually a statistical calculation. So, keeping with that same example, if I observed that more water given to the tree results in more apples, I have observed a correlation. In fact, this would actually be a positive correlation because more water means more apples. A negative correlation would be if more water meant less apples. All right, and causation. Causation is different from correlation in that we're able to prove statistically that the independent variable and nothing else has a direct effect on the dependent variable. If we go back to the apple tree, causation would mean that we have observed the watering of enough apple trees to determine almost exactly how much more water I needed to get a certain amount of apples. However, this is not causation until we have also determined that nothing else is affecting apple growth. So we would also have to measure and either rule out or control the potential effects of soil health, sunlight, the age of the tree, the amount of wildlife and insects that interact with the tree, the proximity of the tree to other trees and what types of trees they are. You get the idea, right? By the way, all those other variables like soil and sunlight would be confounding variables that affect the validity and reliability of my study. Okay, I really hope you guys are still with me. I've only got a few more to get through here. Speaking of validity and reliability, I don't want to dig too deep into this yet, but basically, validity is the extent to which a study accurately measures something. Reliability means that we're able to get the same result over and over again. These are extremely important parts of research. And yes, there are several statistical tests that let us calculate validity and reliability. Okay, the last thing I want to cover is type 1 and type 2 error. So, this is briefly mentioned in the interview you're about to hear. Type 1 error is a false positive, meaning that our study reflected more water means more apples, but in reality, this is not true. Just assuming that for the purposes of defining this. Type 2 error is a false negative, which would mean that our study showed that more water did not give us more apples, but in reality, more water does give us more apples. Listen, errors happen in research all the time, and a lot of studies get published with errors because they're difficult to detect and quantify. We can prevent error by having a larger sample size. So, if I measure the effect of water on 10 apple trees, I'm more likely to have an error in my measurement than if I observed 100 apple trees or 1,000 apple trees. Additionally, repeating the study will help us detect errors. So when you hear about a study being quote unquote debunked, this is what happened. The study was repeated, usually multiple times, and we found out that the first study gave us either a type 1 or type 2 error, either a false positive or a false negative. All right, is everybody still with me? I know that's a lot, but this episode is critical for us to level set on exactly what research is before we start digging into all of the studies out there that are going to give you evidence based solutions. You probably expect me to do all of the heavy lifting here, but I really want you to be able to look at these things critically. We're talking about concepts that measurably affect your work and your life, so I'm also not planning to pull any punches here. All right, it's time to get to the meat. My guest today is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater who specializes in everything from basic OSHA compliance to advanced data analysis techniques and research methods in environmental health and safety. He has 30 years of experience and last year was able to put that experience to the test by working part-time as a safety manager for Research Products Corporation in Madison, Wisconsin. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from University of Minnesota and a Master of Science degree and Ph.D. in Industrial Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with special emphasis on psychology and sociology. He has dedicated his life to educating and assisting others on how to systematically evaluate work and manage organizations to improve safety, productivity, and job satisfaction. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Todd Loushine. Welcome, Dr. Todd. Glad you could join us here on this podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
I want to just start with just a basic question here about research, because this is really an introductory episode for this podcast to talk about research in general, sort of set a level playing field for everybody, just so we all understand what we're talking about and how we should be looking at these things and how we should be digesting these things. So, Dr. Todd, what is research?
Well, let's start with I've been teaching a research methods course that I designed for over 10 years now. So I've got hundreds of students out there, and it's interesting that the comments that I provide back, I really don't have to change them from semester to semester. There is a progression, a natural progression that students go through as they're learning research methodologies. And so for your listeners, what I want to first do is separate out what is problem solving versus research. Because what we do in this profession is a lot of problem solving. And what problem solving is you have the information, you determine what is the best approach or answer, and you pursue it. That's problem solving. And a lot of people think that's research. A lot of people also think that when, like on comment boards and stuff, people are like, oh, do your research. All you're doing is really looking up an answer. That's not research either. What you're attempting to do with research is you're trying to gain understanding of something. And it's typically you want to narrow it to two or a set of variables or how a treatment affects a variable. And I know that sounds horrible. It really does. But bear with me for a moment. We as humans are naturally conditioned to look for patterns in the world or to extrapolate what we observe. And we think it's the real world. When I went to graduate school, after working in the field for like 6 years, my teachers and my instructors would say, well, how did you get that answer? It's like, well, I just knew it. It's what I've done. but I couldn't prove it. And so that was sort of the impetus for moving forward with what is research. And that is another thing is I'll get back to what I was just talking about is when my students have to propose a research proposal, propose research, have to, present a research proposal. That's what I meant to say. They tend to, their first question is usually way too broad. For example, this last semester, I'm not going to say any students' names. One was wondering how online training would compare to face-to-face training when it came to confined space entry, rule compliance, or something like that. And it's interesting. And yeah, that's a typical question we have, something we have to solve. But that's way too broad. And the way my mentors in graduate school taught it to me is that a lot of times when we first come up with a question or an inquiry, we visualize a portrait that we're going to show that this causes that we if we do these things we can expect this as an outcome. But what they said is what a research study is one brushstroke in a portrait. Now imagine that what we really need to do is look at an accumulation of studies to start forming a picture, and instead of naturally assuming that, well, it worked at this time with this group, with this particular condition, and I can extrapolate it, you cannot. So research is a very measured approach. You can call it the scientific approach. When it's social psychology, I call it scientific inquiry, in which we are consuming and documenting pretty much everything that has been published about a relationship or a treatment and how a relationship changes in order to demonstrate that we don't fully understand or know or can fully, give 100% confidence that if we do this, this will happen. And then you set out to, identify a basic construct, study design, measurement tools, how it's going to be collected, all that other stuff. If humans are involved, human subjects protection, and then actually do a data collection, do an analysis that properly assesses statistically that the hypothesis or assumptions are there or not. We assess the type 1, type 2 error. Ah, man, I am really going academic and pedantic here, and I apologize. But ultimately resulting in a yes or no. And then speaking to what the conclusions really mean and the limitations of the study, which you usually find out at the end that, oh, I didn't know that was going to be a problem. So, okay, let's bring it all back to problem solving versus research. Problem solving is we got the information we need, we make a decision. Research is let's see if these things are either relate or affect each other in a given context of a study design.
And there's a lot of stuff you said there that I think are going to bring up all these other topics about sample size and replicating studies and things like that to make sure that we can draw a confident conclusion out of a specific study, or we're confident in the relationship between two variables or something like that.
Right.
Again, I want to keep this we're both academics here.
Yeah.
We're talking to an audience that, not a lot of folks are researchers or academics, and the last thing I want to do is alienate anybody. But I think there's a way that we can put this into terms that a lot of folks can understand. So, real quick, I wanted to ask you, what is your relationship to research? Obviously, I think we've established here that we're both pretty well into research. We do it a lot. What's your relationship here? Why is this stuff important to you?
I mean, in graduate school, like I said, I came in after 6 years of practicing, and all of a sudden it was like full stop. You can't just assume. And the phrase that really helped me understand what it meant and actually created my relationship to research is what you don't know, you don't know. I think was it Deming or Drucker who had said, without data, you're just a person with an opinion. That's like the headline of all of my management classes. I have that picture in his quote that it's looking at things critically, that you don't just take things for granted or assume just because in this particular study or paper they say this will happen or these things are related. It has changed how I practice. It sets a basis for how I teach. I mean, you could talk to my students how analytical I am. People say, well, how can you tell if someone's cheating? Because I track weekly performance and I study it, that I can see when there's deviations to the trends. And that deviation can only be caused by an external force or factor, and then I can investigate what that factor might be instead of catching them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the act. So, how does this help my practice? I when I approach an intervention, and we're talking a safety intervention, and I've had some practice with this, is that I make sure that I have the background information that, what do we know about this? What works, what doesn't work, how is it applied? And then I'll come up with measures. And I'll come up with almost like a pseudo study. And then I'll implement and then I'll track versus this is a solution, put it in place, and then they tell you to track it, but are you tracking the right things? Are the things you're measuring, are they valid and reliable? Okay, we're starting to, go out,
Yeah.
getting back in the academic realm, but it's a critical thought process in which I don't assume that I know everything unless it's been proven in a peer-reviewed article. Does that make sense, I guess?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Kind of a sad
100%.
existence, but that's how I live.
Hey, listen, the reliability and validity thing, I know you say we're, kind of wandering into that academic land, but I think we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. And I think that is I mean, it's an important part for everybody to understand, especially when we're reading beyond the headlines and moving into the actual meat of a study and understanding how it works and whether it's something that really is meaningful. So I want to go to a separate topic here that's very much related. So in this profession, and I'm talking the occupational health and safety profession, environmental health and safety, however you want to frame it, we've seen a large influx of doctoral programs. It used to be there only used to be a couple of different doctoral programs that folks could pursue to get a PhD or a professional doctorate within the safety world. So, for those that are considering that, or those that are trying to understand what that means, what really is the difference between a master's or a graduate degree and a doctoral degree?
That's an excellent question. And again, my experience may be different than some of these newer offerings like you're talking about. I quit my full-time job to go full-time graduate school and worked part-time. Some people are doing the inverse of that, working full-time, going to school part-time. And I do teach in a master's program online. Master's program, we'll just lay that out there. A master's degree is meant to teach the student how to critically review, more importantly, maybe the skills to identify and capture published literature in order to better understand what they're doing. My degree at my university, we have two pathways. One is like a Plan B thesis. Well, you don't really call it that. You call it a applied research project. And the other is just coursework. You have to complete so much coursework. And we do have a what do you call that? A practitioner or applied doctoral degree at our college which is like a DBA, Doctor of Business Administration, versus the other forms of degree. So a master's degree, the student should be able to differentiate between refereed articles or refereed journals and non-refereed, and be able to a certain extent, evaluate critically what is being published. They should be able to do that. And they should be, I always encourage my students to jump down rabbit holes, which is to read a paper, it's exciting, and then there's certain aspects of it that you're not sure about. So you find the reference cited by the author, and then you dive into that one. And several hours later, you're in a completely different place, reading different things. And I think that is the experience a master's student should go through, to be able to follow up, to search, to use their own curiosity, to learn more about something. And by doing so, and by consuming things you're interested in or following a path, your understanding of it grows. And I think in many ways, people question, oh, you got a doctorate, you must be super smart. I had to replicate and hone my critical thinking and research skills. And in doing so, through that practice, I consumed massive volumes of research. That is how I understand things. I wasn't trying to understand. You take a class, there's learning objectives, you try to learn something, you get tested. Did you acquire it? Research is in higher level graduate work is you tell us what you're interested in. We're going to make sure you're doing the technique properly. And then ultimately at the end, when you do your question defense and your final defense, you're really put to task. Did you really think this through? Do you really understand what it means to practice like this? Because can you be, it's you've gone through it too, Matt. You get beat up for several hours and you got to be able to withstand it and answer the questions. So that's what the master's is. Now let's differentiate here because there are more practical or applied master's degrees and there's master of science. There's Master of Arts too, but we won't get into that. A Master of Science needs to have certain qualifications versus applied masters, like a Master of Safety. There probably isn't much or any research methods with that. It's pretty much all coursework, but having to take a stats course, having to take a research methods course, having to write research quality papers through your curriculum, I think is what kind of deems it that Master of Science. Do you want me to talk about doctoral level now?
Yeah, absolutely.
So same thing applies. So we got DBAs. I know a colleague of mine. She has a doctorate, I believe, in healthcare administration or something like that. So there are different versions of practice. And then there are the ultimate nerds like me who went after the PhD in which I had to actually perform and defend an original piece of research, original research study. And then there are ed docs out there, educational doctorate, there's scientific doctorate, doctorate of public health, there's all that stuff. And so it's whether you're going to specialize in application or specialize in theoretical, the foundations of it. Of course, when I went to graduate school, we didn't have all those choices. There was basically one choice and one choice only. And I was full time for over 6 years versus the part time model now, I think is much more abbreviated or condensed or accelerated. So I had to learn a lot of things on my own. I had to figure out a lot. The advantage is I was basically paid to be a grad student. So I was a TA, so I learned the teaching aspects, the assessment of learning aspects. I was a research assistant, so I was an apprentice, and I did a lot of the literature stuff, the data collection, and so I learned that way. So you learn by doing, and I think a lot of safety professionals you learn by doing too. But then ultimately, at the end, I had to prove something, and it's through that process that you get transformed. And I tell my students that even in the master's student, you should transform in some way, shape. But for me, it completely transformed how I practice, how I teach, how I view the world. And that's what it should do. It really should do that. And it should be taxing. It should cause a toll. You go through levels of anxiety, depression, things like that in understanding the world a little bit more. That things are a little bit more trial and error than you know. Things are a lot more anecdotal than you know. And eventually you come to the realization that that's okay because we get lucky quite a bit as humans, but we have something to give now. And so it's like you go through the process and after a while you realize you need to give back. So yeah, let's leave it at that now. Let's keep going.
No, it's a really good point. And personally, so I went through a Doctor of Public Health program, so more of a professional doctorate versus what would traditionally be a research doctorate. And to be honest, these days it depends on the program, but it can be what you make of it.
Yes.
And when I did my doctoral study, I had the option of doing, primary data collection or secondary data collection. Not anybody gets that. For anybody who doesn't understand what that is, so secondary data is where you use an existing data set. Primary data is where you go out and find data that doesn't exist yet. So, I did an original survey with an original instrument amongst a population that had not been studied before, or no data had been collected from that population. And that is what I made of it. And that's really where I've gotten my fire for research. And yeah, exactly like you said, it is a transformational process. Once you go through that, this is what you do, and this is something that you should give back once you do that. It's almost an obligation, I think. Once you, it's not just another set of letters you put behind your name. It is an obligation to continue to contribute that original work to the profession. So
Agreed.
let's go back into research, and again, this whole episode is really just about level setting on what research is and why it's important and what are the things to look for. So there's this argument about correlation versus causation. Tell me about that, Dr. Todd. What are we looking at?
Yeah. Most of the work we do is corollary. A lot of the easy to access research articles that are out there are probably sampling at one point in time. So it's like a cross-sectional. And they're looking to see if when this variable changes, does this change also? And either they can move together, over changes in the measures, or in sort of an opposite tandem. So there'd be like a negative. So it's a positive or negative relationship. And then you can run basic statistics, very basic parametrics to find out if the variances between the two are statistically significant or not. Okay, that's corollary, and that's what we typically do. To infer causality, you need to have a specially designed study in which you have an original state or state zero, the treatment is applied, and then there is a post-treatment status. That means that you had something at this point, it went through something, and now how did it transform? And with a large enough sample and controlling for enough variables, or at least measuring them, you can determine whether statistically this treatment does indeed contribute to that change. That requires more sophisticated statistics, multiple regression, structural equation modeling. I don't like getting highly complex. I'll use regression, but I've never liked super complex statistics because then you're getting into an area of massive assumption. And I think that's something I don't know if this is the time to talk about it, but when we start talking about injury data, work comp data, that data set does not meet the basic assumption of normality. And if we don't have normality, we shouldn't be reporting average. And now we can talk about, distributions and things like that, but I think it would be nice, I think, if our field did more of an introspective evaluation of what we think we know. Because I know of some things that were assumed and we kind of have moved on with it, and now it becomes populist, and so therefore the populist thing's true. But when you look back at the original studies that it was predicated on, there were some pretty considerable errors that maybe they weren't able to tease out because they didn't understand the breadth of it. They took it narrow. Okay, let's go back to the original question because I just went off on a huge tangent, which I tend to do.
No, no, no. It's a really good tangent because, I do a lot of data collection just in my day job. And, I collect a lot of the data that is out there that is widely accepted by the industry. And unfortunately, I find myself having to preface this when I present it and saying, by the way, we know this data is statistically insignificant as as presented. However, it is an industry accepted standard, and so this is what I have to give you. But
Right.
I think that's a whole separate episode.
Yeah.
And,
Sorry about that.
no, no, no. I think it's something great to bring up. I think right now, let's just start, for the audience that's out there, let's just start critically thinking about those things. And we'll definitely dig into that on a separate podcast.
Let's go back. What was the question again? Because I went way off the
We are
topic.
we are
Sorry.
talking about correlation versus causation.
Oh, right. Okay. So I think I kind of defined. I think I defined it. Yeah. It
Yeah,
was
I think
okay.
I
Yeah.
think we're in good shape. You know, and I think another way you could do that is just the resources that go into these two separate things, right?
Oh, right. Yes.
Right. I mean, when you started talking about causation, we're really getting into long, resource heavy type of studies that allow for you to run those more complicated statistics, draw inferences from a larger sample size
Yes.
and a much more controlled environment. So when we get into experimental studies, or truly experimental studies, that's what we're talking about there. And
Right. And the other thing too is the approach, the design, the construct of it. Like a lot of my students want to use injury as an outcome. And I said, well, what type of injury? What severity? There are different classifications of it. And I said, now, how often does that really happen? Is there a proxy to injury that is something that can be measured more readily versus having to do something like you had said over a year's time? Can you do it within several weeks? And sometimes you also have to think about when you implement a change, how long until an effect could be measured reasonably? And then you got to set a sampling window. So yeah, study research design is very complex. There's a lot of variability there, and unless you do a really diligent job of reviewing everything that's been done, studying all the designs, not only the results but the design, you're going to run into problems, and that is going to cause a limitation of what your results are, or possibly make it so they're not extrapolate. You can't extrapolate the results to other populations, conditions, things like that. Which is that's another thing too. Is okay. You got a positive statistical relationship. Is it spurious? Did you really vet all the confounding variables? Are there any mediators or moderators in that design that you didn't know about before? And so that was a term I'd written down that I wanted to bring up. Spurious, a relationship that really isn't there the way you think it is.
Really, no, really good point to bring up. So, whenever we're doing these studies, there are all sorts of other things that can complicate, all sorts of other factors or variables that can complicate the relationship between two things, right? So, if I know that a certain demographic characteristic is associated with outcomes of severe injuries and fatalities, there's all sorts of other things along the way that could be causing complications with that relationship. And it could be the type of work that that population is subjected to. It could be, I mean, all sorts of other things. If we're looking at age, well, it could also be their nationality, where they were born, or what kind of culture they're subjected to, or the type of work that they're doing. There are all sorts of other factors here. So, and that's where we get into other statistics that are able to calculate the amount of effect each one of those factors has. But we're not going to dive too deep into that right now.
I think it's good to point that out, though, yeah, because I think a lot of the underlying issues in safety research is not establishing what you had just brought up, and therefore we assume and proliferate, propagate those results into other things, and then we're not getting similar results. But what we tend to do is go, well, it seems right, looks good, and therefore it must be true. And that's not the way it is. And so I think we've got a lot of misunderstandings, but I don't even know where to begin, because it seems right or it has worked.
On this podcast, the plan is to go through a lot of studies that are out there so that we can bring evidence to the solutions that are proposed, all of these big ideas that are out there. We'd like to look at data. We'd like to look at existing studies. A lot of that is going to come from articles that are out there. And when I'm talking about articles, I'm talking about academic articles that are in peer-reviewed journals, things like that. Now, for the average listener, I'm assuming a lot of folks have looked at articles or seen articles or read them, but there's definitely a right and a wrong way to read an article. So if I bring up an article, what is the right way to start reading a peer-reviewed article?
Peer reviewed's different. Peer reviewed will have a structure to it that it's easier that you can actually consume it different than linearly. And I think a question that you may get to, but I would just want to bring it up is, what about the headline and abstract? And I know that some of my students do a Google search, they find an abstract, sounds good, they cite it. You shouldn't do that. That's unethical. And I would liken, reading a title in an abstract and thinking you know what the study's all about, that could you explain to me how this meal tastes by reading it in the menu? Because that's all you're doing. You need to actually experience it. You need to consume it, digest it. That was actually a pretty good analogy.
That was good.
Right off the top of
Yeah,
my head, not bad.
I'll take it.
But the right way to read an article, I like to read it start to finish because it's a presentation by the authors, the researchers, providing or educating me on the context and scope and possibly the justification for it, the background information that really gave us what we already know about it. But that's always really interesting, and when students read that, they see that as more of like almost like a textbook chapter, and so they really spend a lot of time on that. That's probably the mistake. I like to look at the methods. What's your study design? How much did you collect? Over what period of time? How did you validate your methodologies? And then, how are you going to analyze it? Are you analyzing it in a way that is actually testing either the hypothesis or what you're proposing may be related? And then I want to see the results. I sometimes people think, oh, well, just, a couple tables. I read it. It needs to make sense to me that the numbers they're providing kind of fit the narrative of their recommend or the conclusions. And then I spend a majority of my time reading the conclusions. What do they think it found? Does that fit with what I saw? Are they being honest on the limitations? Here's the thing. If you have an article that has zero limitations, that it's all perfect, it's wrong because it's almost impossible to have a perfect study. But I also like to look at the references. Here's the thing. When you're kids and you play that, you get in a circle and you tell someone something and it goes around the circle and it comes back and it's different. The message is
Oh,
different.
telephone. The
Telephone.
game
Yeah.
telephone. Yeah.
I sometimes get concerned that if people are only citing or referencing more recent research, how much, bias, how much changing of the original message of the foundational or seminal research has been changed. So I almost do like a bibliography assessment. Are they citing both foundational seminal work and maybe more current stuff that kind of builds up to what they're trying to figure out, or is it purely more recent stuff? Now I'm probably a little bit of a snob for doing that, but that's just a technique I had picked up when I was a grad student because my mentors, my advisors were highly critical of providing a full and defendable set of references for supporting what they are contending. Does that make sense? So, again, let's go back to how do you read it? I like to do it start to finish. I spend a little bit more time really understanding the methods and the results. Does that make sense to me? I spend a majority of my time at the end of the paper. And actually, for my research students, research method students, they're asking me, how do I come up with a good question? Read the back of the paper because the authors are given a little bit of flexibility. They can be a little bit more liberal at the end that, yeah, this is what we wanted to do. This is what we found. But wouldn't it be interesting if, or what, I love that. And that's where I got my topic for my dissertation in grad school was reading the back of the papers. But for the user, it's consume it. Go ahead, consume it, linearly from start to finish. But if you have the training to be able to dissect and understand methods and do some, you look at the results and do some, does it make sense to me? That's great. But don't get, here's my thing. Don't get caught up in the intro. The intro is always the most interesting.
Yeah. So okay. So I see a news article that says new study finds that, I don't know, human infants are 20% more likely to throw fecal matter than chimpanzee infants.
Wow.
Am I done?
Interesting. Oh, I mean, here's the thing. It depends on what you want to do with it. Depends on your level of how much you need to use it for your own work. Yeah, a news article, they're probably only reading the abstract, by the way. So they're trying to summarize from the abstract. They're looking at
A summary of a
a
summary.
summary of a summary. Yeah, which now can actually cause misinterpretation. I mean, I've actually seen that before. I've seen it multiple times, even in local news, that, hey, this report says this, but then you go read it, it's like, ooh, that was what you read was you interpreted it in your context, but if you kept reading, it completely changed it. And I mean, we don't even have enough time off the top of my head when I can speak to some of the errors we have in our field, where people have misinterpreted and carried on a misrepresentation of what the paper was really talking about, either overemphasizing its significance, underrepresenting its significance, or completely debasing what was actually found in that study.
Yeah. You know, so a real headline that I did see one time, and this was when I was working on my graduate work, was it was so this was about the time that vaping started really getting popular. And the study said, new study finds that the chemical for popcorn lung, or the chemical that causes popcorn lung, found in vaping containers. Now, so anybody that's in working in industrial hygiene is probably familiar with the popcorn lung chemical and all the things around that. That's a pretty well-known incident. So I think where I struggled with this was, okay, so everybody who's against vaping is going to latch onto this. Everybody who is a vapor may not really care about this. And then there's going to be some other folks like me that are going to say, okay, hold on a second. there's a lot more that we don't know behind this headline. If I mean, just saying that the chemical for popcorn lung, or the chemical that causes popcorn lung, is in the container, the vials for vaping, doesn't really tell me the whole story. It doesn't tell me how much is a vapor actually exposed to that chemical. Are they going over the limit of what they can be exposed to that chemical without getting sick or without having the adverse effects, without getting popcorn lung? Or do they get popcorn lung no matter what if they vape? So there's a lot of information that you need beyond just that headline. And I think that's where a lot of that misinterpretation comes from.
Yes. One that really bothers me was when the pandemic hit and they're saying mask and distance and stuff. And everywhere I was seeing this meme that said that there's a study that showed that wearing a mask, decreases oxygen and increases carbon dioxide in the blood and all that stuff. So I found the article, I found the publication. And what they were doing is they had a very small group of nurses in which they put on a mask and then they had to get them on a treadmill. And they put a sensor inside the mask to measure oxygen, carbon dioxide levels. And then they also did, like a sensor on them that was doing the blood ox. Here's the thing. That sensor was picking up high levels of carbon dioxide and lower levels of oxygen. They're saying, well, of course, now these people they're suffocating. But what is the speed of the device? What is it really measuring? Is it measuring exhale, which is going to have lower, or is it measuring inhale? And is it the right instrument to do that? And so people took this basic measure, which, if you really look at it from a validity perspective, it's the wrong instrument to use. It's not a good way to do it. The blood ox did not change. So right there, there's a difference, and that should have been explored, but somebody took that basic finding and extrapolated it to masks are dangerous. And that really upset me. And I tried to post a few things here or there, but it's difficult to fight a tsunami of misinformation. I mean, what is the quote? Misinformation can get all the way around the world before the truth gets finished putting on its shoes. And that's really what it seemed like. And yeah, the pandemic was so interesting to see how fast misinformation would get spread when all it would take would be a little bit of time to investigate, what was the source and was the source reliable? What was really put there? And I think that's to your point, is that we have quite a bit of that going on, that when it makes sense, it seems to make sense within a person based on their observation of the world, it becomes truth, But as scientists, that what we don't know, that curiosity is what forces us, motivates us to dig deeper, to really understand it. And if it isn't really well understood, well, then let's create a study to figure it out.
Yeah, 100%. I'm going to actually combine a couple of different questions here that we have because this is all about the same topic. But when I'm reading these articles, whether it be peer reviewed or non-peer reviewed, what are the pitfalls that I need to look for? How do I critique each different type of article? And, what does it mean? I mean, how should I really be exploring those types of things?
That's a great question. And I'll put it within the context of risk. A non-peer reviewed article has a greater risk of containing non-verified information, taking leaps of faith to understand the connections between things. It doesn't have a testament of validity and reliability, but it doesn't mean it's bad or false. It just has a higher risk of being so. A peer-reviewed article, on the other hand, this has been something that's been reviewed and discussed and gone through several sessions, I'll say, of edit and review. And there's a realistic chance in which somebody tries to submit something and it gets denied straight up because the experts who agreed to review it on a voluntary basis, just it doesn't fit with everything they have done in their profession, in their field. And so there's a less risky chance of anything in those types of publications to be false or overbearing or things like that. Though there still could be some. And I mean, we could talk about those as well, but they tend to be more minute and very infrequent. But now that we're talking about it, they may actually do more harm because we build upon them without fully vetting. And so, yeah, there's less risk in falsehoods or misunderstandings in peer-reviewed versus non-peer-reviewed, but it doesn't mean that non-peer-reviewed are not valuable and that they don't contain a bunch of truth. So maybe the next question is, well, how do you figure that out? I look at the authors, their author's background, what's their education, what have they published before? If an author is talking about this innovative risk assessment approach and their entirety of their work and education was in theology, I question it. Like, where did that come from, right? And I'll also look at what are they referencing? Again, that's me looking at the references to bibliography. Are they did they look at the seminal works and more recent works, or just purely the recent works? And is there a chance that there has been some bias or issues in more recently published things? That's another thing I'll look at too. But I shared with you an article I'd published in like 2014 in which I did an analysis in a popular, professional journal that's out there, and having just one individual on the paper increased its validity and reliability because of the quality and amount of references provided, and they tended to have a data analysis result versus anecdotal, observational, non-critical analysis in the paper. I would really love to redo that. I'd do another 10-year scope of that to see if it's changed at all. But typically, what you'll see is peer-reviewed will have a much higher bar in which to meet in order to be published versus one that is not. It may just be an editorial review, making sure that the grammar's right, that it looks good, and you have to look at that. I think, is that enough?
Yeah, no, I honestly look, there's a lot of issues or pitfalls even to look for within peer-reviewed articles
Yes.
that I think you're alluding to here. I've looked at some peer-reviewed articles that are really just literature reviews, and literature reviews can be great, but it is bringing in a bunch of different sources and sort of providing some anecdotes around these different things to try to come to some sort of conclusionary story about the topic. And that's all fine and dandy, but there's no actual data within that specific article. And then I've seen other quote unquote peer reviewed articles where I look in the references and I see that the author has cited himself or herself for 80% of the references.
I know which researchers you speak of. Yes, they tend to do that. And what's interesting too is, and thank you for bringing up the literature review. A literature review is a essential part of any research study. You have to establish what is known. And so when I see something published where all they're doing is, hey, I looked a bunch of stuff up and here's my answer, I agree with you. It's like, well, what value does that provide? But if somebody is proposing a model or a construct and they do an extensive, exhaustive literature review to piece it together and to prove that how these things relate, that in many times they'll publish that just because they put so much work into it, and then they'll use that as the basis for writing a grant or as just the introduction then for the research that's coming. And so I think sometimes what researchers or at least academics will do is do something like that. And they'll just publish their extensive literature review just to get another publication because we need that for promotion and tenure. And then I'm okay. I don't mean to break the secret, but yes, we try to get as much publication out of the work we do as possible. And so you just have to look at it that way. Is it proofing or providing verification for a model or the basis for future research or research agenda? Or is it just someone who is like, hey, I think this is the way the world is. I did a literature review. By the way, they probably accepted more of what agreed with them versus the confounding or the stuff that violated or dissented on their message. And so you got to watch out for those, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no, I honestly, I had a professor one time that had published many articles that stemmed from one study,
Yep.
and it didn't invalidate the articles themselves. All of them were about different topics within the same study.
Hmm.
And but that does happen, and it's something to look for. Just going to the last question that I have here on this page is behind every study, every article, everything every piece of content that's out there, there's an intention. There is some reason that that person is writing that content. So how do I figure out what the intention is behind a specific piece of content or research that I'm consuming?
Okay, I'll try to keep this politically correct because I know that there are people who publish just because they want the attention. What they're publishing doesn't provide much knowledge, or what they claim they found isn't extrapolated beyond the confines of the case study which they really performed. And there was no attempt to be critical of the design, the variables, or the measures. You'll see that in some of the non-referee journals out there. The other reason people do it, like we had started out, Matt, you and I talking, that we feel like there is, we need to give back. It's required as an academic to do a certain level of scholarly activity. And, we spent so much time absorbing, a lot of the foundational work that it's our responsibility, it's our duty to attempt to take it this much further. And that's all you really try to do, is just take it this much further. And what's interesting too is, if you're at an R1 university, a research-based university, land grant, you're probably going to have to chase a certain quantity of grants. In which case, now it's not really a passion project anymore. It's a financial grab. And then you build a lab and you get grad students and you publish your work, and you get some enjoyment out of it. When you're in a non R1, you really get to be selective on what you want to research. Now, it's going to be difficult to compete with the larger university researchers. They're going to acquire a lot of the money from, federal agencies, think tanks, things like that. But you can sort of simplify it. And that's really what we're finding is, if research is not your primary focus as an academic, you can be a little more selective and you tend to be more applied. And I would like, if I had my druthers, it'd be great if more of our professional associations would help that level. That the ones who want to do practical research, let's support that, versus the, millions of dollars that go out to the R1s to do research that nobody gets to read and it's really hard to understand, but it's part of the academic vehicle that some of us have been on for a while. Ideally, what we'd like to see is more collaboration between the practitioners who observed phenomena in the world, they're not fully understand it, and the faculty who are really interested in it. Because the difficulty of doing practical or applied research, or research that can be put into practice, you can use whatever moniker you want, is study conditions and subjects. It's really hard to get, and it's hard to control, and it requires a lot of trust in, the company trusting that, things are being taken care of, trust from the researcher to the site or the source that they will uphold their original commitment. And that's the problem I see with a lot of master students doing research, is that it's just easier to put out like a survey monkey, because if you want to go out and do research at a site, they get scared because what if they find something that makes us look bad? Well, we already put that all the data we collect, we're going to keep the sources anonymous. We're going to report in aggregate, so it would never really show. We would never, anywhere in our work would we identify the site, but still there's this concern. And so that's the problem right now, is being able to do quality practical research, because of the two sides just can't find a good place to meet and get that done. And I think that's too bad. And I always think that when I hear practitioners saying, well, we want more researchers to do practical work, researchers are like, give us the access. That's where it stops.
Well, Dr. Todd, I really appreciate the time that you've given us today. I think this is a lot of valuable information and helps us level set on exactly what we're looking at and exactly what we're talking about when we talk about research and data and all of this stuff that we should be using for evidence-based practice. The last question I want to ask you, is there anything you're working on right now or anything you have worked on recently that you would like listeners to know about?
Oh, thank you for asking. That's a new one, by the way, you guys, so I get to talk. Yes, I've always questioned the validity and reliability of the data provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the annual census of fatalities and the survey of occupational injury and illnesses. Because, I was taught and I teach to calculate incidence rates, compare them to the NAICS peers to see how you're doing. But lo and behold, I've analyzed dozens, hundreds of work comp data sets for companies and found that when I do the distribution, it's very non-normal. It's actually asymptotic. So the average and median are very, very different. And therefore, how can we report an average? Here's the other thing. When you collect all that's occurred and divide it by all the time, you're getting an overall or a diluted number of what an average might be, even though it's not the average. I would rather that you'd calculate a number for each individual. Therefore, when you do that, you can now provide a median, a standard deviation, all that other stuff, which I think is more insightful because now you can actually do an analysis of outliers and look at outliers differently than the 80% that falls below that. I'm referring to the Pareto ratio. So I downloaded all of the OSHA ATI, the application, the 300 days that everybody's been uploading and looked at them and found some considerable errors. 12% per year of the entries are unusable. They're not realistic. And so I just submitted the paper. It's going to be published in Shift, I think, in the next quarter. But we just started scratching the surface. I'm going to be able to do an analysis of by size of company. I'm going to be able to do an analysis comparing OSHA program states against federal OSHA states to find out if there's a difference. I'm going to be able to look at the pyramid of severity, which I've never agreed with the criticism of Heinrich because if you take the pyramid and flip it on its side, you have a distribution. Distributions are better representations. Up to and including, I'm actually going to be writing a paper right now with a colleague of mine, really questioning this whole SIFs idea because the data that I analyzed and corrected through OSHA does not fit or correlate in any way with what those original researchers. I think it was Manuel who first came up with it, like in 2004. And so I think we really need to rethink it. It's taking a lot of work because whenever I do I run like a quick analysis on something, it crashes Excel. So I've been running some stuff through SPSS. I'll be writing a paper on normality and what that means, first of all, with injury data, and then I'll be doing those comparisons to find out what's really going on. So that's where a lot of my work is. It's all around analytics. What can we come up with that's better than incidence rates? Or what the common person calls an incident rate. It's an incidence. You know this, your public health. So yeah, that's what I'm working on, and I'm hoping to come up with a series of papers that explain this analysis, along with some earlier work that I had done that I hadn't published fully, and that is that safety climate is a lagging indicator. I found that it's more aligned with how management responds to injuries than it is what workers think of management. And I could actually dig into some of the issues that Zohar's original work had, and where those questions on his survey came from, which was a survey of people attending a conference. The construct validity is questionable, therefore the results are questionable. Therefore, I think we need to rethink some of those things. So what am I all getting to? What can we give people as far as how to measure to anticipate? Because if we can anticipate, then we can put in changes before bad things happen. That's what I'm working on right now.
Thanks, Dr. Todd. I look forward to, I'm 100% certain that you are going to be a guest on this podcast again, talking about maybe those specific things and maybe some of the other tangential things that we didn't dive deep into today.
Yeah, we scratched the surface, but I think we hit some of the main tenets of what is real research, which I think is the
Yeah,
purpose of the inaugural or the kickoff
exactly.
episode. Yep.
Exactly. 100%. Well, thanks, Dr. Todd. Definitely appreciate your time today. And I know the listeners will appreciate it too.
Thank you very much.
Wow. So I can definitely say that I will try to get Dr. Todd back on the podcast for a future episode. I really want to dig into some of the things he's working on right now. But between now and then, we have plenty of other research and evidence based practices to talk about. If you have a study you want to share on the podcast, whether it's your own research or your evaluation of someone else's research, send me an email at contact@proveitpod.com. That's contact@proveitpod.com. I'd love to dig into what you have to say. Until next time, remember that without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So get to measuring and prove it to me. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Dr. Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you have research you want to share, send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single-use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.